Hi, it's Christina with the Sisyphean Journal. I had somebody who probably followed the link from X over to my YouTube channel, the article, video I published about the 2 patients that John Biskind needlessly killed when the medical board decided that ripping big holes in a woman's uterus and just, let her bleed isn't a problem. I got 3 very ill-informed responses from her, and I'm going to address the first one first. Legal abortion is still 14 times safer than childbirth. Excuse me, let me get my dog to shut up. Here you go get it. Okay, I spent 6 months of my life researching exactly how the CDC gets their numbers to count abortion deaths. Okay? Now, I am going to start by comparing it to how we would count, say, liver cancer deaths. Each state, and like New York City, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, they all, if they have a separate statistical unit, they send theirs separately. But we'll just say states. They each send a sample of their death certificate data to the National Center for Health Statistics, NCHS. I forget the exact number. Let's just say 10% because it makes the math easy, okay? So the NCHS does not get 100% of death certificate data. They get a percentage, a sample, 10%. If they look at that sample and see 3,000 people dead from liver cancer, they don't go, oh, 3,000 people in the United States died of liver cancer. No, they know that that's a sample. They know that all the liver cancer deaths aren't going to be in that 10% sample. So they extrapolate and they say, okay, if the 10% sample has 3,000 cancer deaths, that means there were 30,000 cancer deaths nationwide. That's how everything else is treated, but not abortion. Okay? The CDC gets their raw data from the NCHS. They send, okay, here, all the abortion data. Then, if there are no abortion deaths in that 10% sample, the CDC also assumes that the other 90% of deaths in that state included 0 abortion deaths. So they'll count 0 abortion deaths for that state. If there's 1 abortion death in that 10% sample, they assume that that is all the abortion deaths for that state, that the 90% that wasn't sampled doesn't also have an abortion death in it. So they don't extrapolate. They don't go, okay, we get data from 50 states and Washington, D.C. and New York City and Puerto Rico and whatever. And, that counted 8 abortion deaths. So probably that was a 10% sample. There were probably 80. That's not how they do it. They just assume that somehow magically, just some kind of magic, when they take this random sample from the state, somehow every abortion death ends up in that sample, which we know that's not going to be true. So the way the CDC calculates abortion deaths is like going into an apple orchard and putting a basket under the tree, and then you count the apples that landed in the basket, and you conclude that that is all the apples that fell off the tree. You don't count the ones that are laying on the ground. That's how they count abortion deaths, and then they make their calculations from there. And the other sneaky thing they do is the abortion deaths are also counted in the denominator, because that's another in the denominator for pregnancy deaths. So if a woman dies from an abortion and the CDC bothers to count her as an abortion death, that's 1 additional pregnancy that a childbirth death is counted for. So that's a little bit more complicated. Now, they will say, well, we find out about them in other ways. Sometimes people send us news clippings. Sometimes the state health department reports a specific one, so we're sure we get them all. I call bullshit on that, okay? And I'm going to give you an example of why I call absolute bullshit on that. Dr. Robert Christ discussed the hemorrhage death of a 17-year-old abortion patient at the National Abortion Federation Risk Management Seminar in Dallas, Texas in 1992. He said, last year I had a 17-year-old patient bleed to death. Present at that seminar were Stanley Henshaw and Lisa Coonan of the CDC Abortion Surveillance Branch. Now, Stanley Henshaw isn't quite as important as Lisa Coonan. Lisa Coonan, her job part of her job duties was to gather information on abortion deaths. Okay, so here's an abortion death being discussed at a meeting she attended. This seminar, she attended it. This death was discussed there. Okay, then let's talk about Latache Vial. This was a 17-year-old girl who bled to death after an abortion performed by Dr. Robert Christ in 1991. Her family hired a lawyer. They sued. There was massive, massive news coverage, both in Texas, where Latache died, and in Missouri, which was Chris' home state. And a couple years earlier, he had performed a fatal abortion on a 19-year-old intellectually disabled rape victim. So they considered this second death to be newsworthy. And of course, because... Let me get my dog to shut up again. Because it was showing up in the mainstream media, the pro-lifers picked up on it. So Feminists for Life, National Right to Life News, the little local pro-life newsletters, they were all covering it. Pretty much every pro-lifer in the country knew about Latache Viel's death. Do you know who didn't notice? Lisa Coonan. Do you know how I know she didn't notice? Latache, we checked with the family's lawyer. Latache was a black girl. The CDC counted 0 deaths of black patients between the ages of 15 and 19. Her death could not have been more obvious if she had crawled to Atlanta and expired on the floor of Lisa Coonan's office with her aftercare instructions clutched in her hand. And they still didn't count her. So that should disabuse you of any idea that they know or even care how many abortion deaths there are in this country. They count enough to pretend they've gone through the motions, and then they compare that to the maternal deaths where they do. Okay, so let's extrapolate and let's figure out how many actually died. They count them differently, and then they compare them. And people like this, oh, what does she call herself? Emma Jones, 8590, are like, yeah, it's I totally tried to put it PubMed, so it's got to be true. No, it's not. They're bullshitting you.